talk to me about the Confucius Institutes. What was the other one that you mentioned?
The Chinese Students and Scholars Association.
Yeah, are those? What are they doing?
Confucius Institutes are essentially a relationship between an American university and a Chinese university that's managed by the Chinese government. And there isn't anything inherently weird about this. There are other countries like France and Germany and the UK that have these kinds of soft power educational institutions that they encourage universities around the world to work with. So, on its face, there's nothing weird there. But the problem is, if you are an authoritarian government, there are naturally going to be some questions that arise about, a university partnering with an educational institution run by a government that likes to jail its critics.
Right.
And so there was, a lot of reasonable concerns about these institutions. And so over the past 5 to 10 years, there's a lot of media attention, legislative attention on Confucius Institutes that ultimately ended up in most of them closing. So I think there's probably a handful of them left here in the US at this point. At their high point, maybe about 115. There's a separate thing called Confucius's Classrooms, the K through 12 setting, but that's, I believe, on its way out as well. But there were a few documented instances of interference from Confucius Institutes where people who worked at the institutes tried to coordinate with university leadership to censor discussions happening on campus, most often about Tibet or Taiwan, to try to ensure that the Chinese government's perspective was the one that was presented on campus. So there were definitely some concerning incidents that arose just from the institutes themselves. But
Hmm.
more broadly, there's just the question of what kind of incentives does it create for universities when they accept funding from an authoritarian government? And, can they navigate those contracts, those partnerships in a way that's going to be conducive to academic freedom? I'm not sure that there is, but at least this is probably something I've said 100 times by now. But at least there needs to be transparency
Yeah.
about how the universities are managing these contracts. How is the contract open to the public, or is it a private kind of secret contract that people can't see? Do people know how the teaching materials are being used? Um, these are questions universities have to be able to answer. But for the most part, Confucius Institutes are on their way out. That does not mean that universities' partnerships with Chinese universities are on their way out. But the Confucius Institute itself, you're not going to see those very much on
How
campuses.
how come they're on their way out?
There was a lot of attention, primarily from legislators who were asking universities to explain their partnerships with the Confucius Institutes. There were, a number of senators and representatives who wrote letters to their universities encouraging them to, sever those ties. There were even some states that passed legislation to target the presence of those Confucius Institutes themselves. So and some of it there wasn't even a demand or a requirement, but the amount of media attention I think became sort of untenable, and it became not worth the benefit of having them. So I think a lot of most of the universities just decided either they were kind of pressured to do so, or they just decided this is no longer we're no longer getting what this is costing us.
Yeah.
Legislatively and in the media. So they chose to move on from those. But the other group that I mentioned, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, or CSSAs, so these are student groups that are at campuses across the US. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with the CSSA or what the group is, because ultimately what all student groups are places and institutions for people of shared background, interest, values to coordinate together and have events and stay in contact. That's what any student group is. But the problem with CSSAs is they have been involved in many of the attempts to silence speakers on campuses, not just in the US either. This is something that happens on campuses around the world as well. So there have been some pretty disturbing incidents of CSSA chapters trying to pressure university leaders to step in and interfere with student speech on campus. So one of those that I mentioned was at George Washington University, but there were incidents at Brandeis University as well. There was going to be a panel about Uyghur rights and about abuses of minorities within China. And the CSSA chapter there attempted to get the university to cancel it. They had a form letter that they were encouraging people to sign that said, the university needs to be presenting other views of China and that they shouldn't be having this one-sided criticism of China take place on campus.
Mm.
And Brandeis did not cancel the event, but that took place, I believe, in 2020 when everything was on Zoom, and so that event was Zoom bombed. People were playing the national anthem, China's national anthem, over speakers, so it was severely disruptive. I think it's pretty disturbing, the idea that people who have been victims of human rights abuses in China can't fully trust that they would be able to come here to the United States and speak freely about it at a college campus. I think that's unnerving. Similarly, at the University of Chicago, there is an exiled Hong Kong activist named Nathan Law, who was a democracy campaigner. He was invited to be part of a speaker series at U Chicago, and the CSSA chapter there wrote a letter to the university saying that he was outside the bounds of free expression, that he was not allowed to speak on campus, and that the university had a duty to respect its students and ensure that they didn't feel attacked or treated unfairly on campus. And so there's this term I'm kind of using in the book, sensitivity exploitation.
Yeah.
But this idea that, people are using universities' interests or interest in being a welcoming, open place where people are not targeted for their background or who they are, trying to use that in service of in support of a foreign power that's silencing people's rights. So, they're saying if the university wants to stop hate, they won't have this Tibetan speaker here or this Taiwanese speaker here because it's deeply hurtful to thousands of students on campus.
I mean, we're using it in the United States to silence people, so I don't know why they couldn't figure out how to do it as a foreign power. Like,
Well,
it's not we do this in our own country to each other now, exploit sensitivity to silence critics.
yeah, and that's something that I argue for in the book, that this is why one of the reasons why universities need to be careful that they don't have carelessly written policies, because if you do have a practice of acting against hurtful, insensitive, offensive speech, there are going to be people who have very wide understandings of what those terms are and what they mean, and they're going to want to use it in ways that, to me, read bad faith, but to them, that's their point of view, and so it's much wiser for universities to have at the start viewpoint neutral policies, so they're not being in a position of deciding, okay, whose side do we take when it becomes, when we're deciding who can speak about human rights issues in China, who's allowed to speak and who's it offensive to if we do let this person speak but don't let this other person speak. And it's, very easy, I think, to get pulled into sort of embarrassing mistakes if you
Mm.
start choosing who can speak based on who's offensive, because these are the kind of situations you're going to come across as a institution with people from around the world.